Yep, we're good.
So, just wanted to let you know that this presentation, like I said earlier, is hot off the press. We have met the OSEP requirement for transition compliance, which is we're excited about. But in order to maintain and sustain that level of compliance, we feel that we still need to continue to reach out to the field and to support them in the building of transition plans. So we've come up with a really not necessarily unique information, but more information about planning for transition for children with disabilities in high school. So this is actually Dan's PowerPoint. He's put a lot of work and research into it, and he's going to go through it with you. It is typically a 2-hour presentation. We did take the case study off so that you won't be spending time doing that, but it is typically a 2-hour presentation, and so it's a lot to it. But it's good information, and I hope that if you have questions afterwards or during, that's fine. I hope you to be open and collaborative. We try to be very transparent with where we are at the state and what we're doing at the state. I'm basically all things transition for our team, so I oversee a lot of transition, other things other than this B13, but we are doing a lot of things for transition at the state. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan because he's a presenter for this.
All right. Does everybody have a copy of the PowerPoint? Great. All right, so again, as Roberta mentioned, this is an extension of B13, which is the 13th federal indicator that we have to report to the federal government every year. So this is, part one is basic compliance with the indicator, and this is going above and beyond what that basic compliance means for the for this indicator. So it's, kind of think of it as we are working through this, that it's really an extension on the first part. So if there's missing pieces in terms of the IEP process, it may be because it's an extension from the first training. So if you need clarity at any point, just please feel free to ask, and we can provide that. So we don't have to do introductions. We're going to go over the purpose of this training, and again, the disclaimer is that this is intended for those individuals that write transition plans and write IEPs for children that are transition aged. So we'll go over the purpose of that. We'll go over transition planning and how it relates to the IEP. We'll go over some litigation that's been around the country in recent years. We'll share some state and nationwide data. We'll include some resources and some strategies, and then we have a few examples of post-secondary IEP goals. And then we have questions at the end, but if you have questions along the way, just shout them out and we'll be happy to address them. So the purpose is to develop and implement effective post-secondary strategies to promote better outcomes for young adults with disabilities. The purpose of the original training is to write compliant transition plans. So the purpose of this training is to build on that basic compliance, really moving beyond just basic compliance. The transition plan is section 10 of the IEP. There's IDEA, so the federal regulation, says that transition plan training should begin when the child is 16 years old. MUSER, the Maine Unified Special Education Regulation, which is our state regs, say that should begin in 9th grade. So actually our state regulations opens up the possibility for a transition planning at a younger age. So it actually goes above and beyond what the federal requirement is. So that's good for us as a state, and we're providing that transition opportunity at younger ages. That 15-year-olds and in some cases 14-year-olds are beginning that process of transition planning. So moving along to some litigation. This was in Ohio. This is from 6 years ago, and it was this went against the district, and there was a lot of other pieces involved in the litigation, but this is really how it relates to transition. Student involvement is really, really important when we are working through post-secondary transition planning. In this specific case, the district was not able to provide evidence that the student was invited to their IEP team meeting. And we know, again, building off of that basic compliance, that the child, if they are of transition age, should be invited to the IEP meeting. In this case, the child wasn't invited to the meeting. And it's also in part of that transition, that planning for transition, you have to obtain the child's interests. That's really what drives the transition assessments, that really what drives the programming within that transition plan. And again, there was no evidence that the district obtained those preferences and interests. So again, two really, really big things that every transition plan should begin with were missing in this. And then transition assessments. There wasn't, again, evidence that they even did age-appropriate assessments or utilize the results of those assessments to determine post-secondary goals. In the fall, we were at a national conference, and there was a lot of talk around transition and litigation. And the keynote speaker there, he was from Carolina, one of the Carolinas. He was through the due process down there. One of his main points of the keynote was that if you're not conducting age-appropriate assessments, it's very difficult to really make a transition plan because it all starts at what those assessments are saying and what, take the preferences and interests of the child, match it with those age-appropriate assessments, and use that data to really determine what programming would be in the transition plan and what services you're going to provide. So that was all absent in this case, and it ended up costing the district over $250,000. At the time, it was remanded, so they made the decision and they remanded it to a lower court. But at the time that they did, it cost the district a lot of money. And that's, again, this isn't a unique case. I mean, inviting the child to the IEP team meeting, having a conversation with the child about, or the individual about what they want to do when they leave high school, that's like step one of transition planning. So, not following those basic steps, really, it costs the district a lot of money, but more importantly, that transition plan for that child is not appropriate, and then FAPE becomes that issue if that transition plan is not appropriate.
And just to back up what Dan is saying, we are out in the field right now looking at transition plans, and we still see evidence where students aren't invited to the IEP meetings. So it really is a little bit disheartening because we have put a lot of money and efforts into training local school districts. We now go into the high schools directly and talk to educators, and we're still seeing absences of some of these things. So, the message, given the fact that there are a lot of educators leaving the field and a lot of educators coming into the field, that the message continues to be consistent.
Quick question, sometimes you have parents uses they don't want their child in the transition meeting. Document it.
Yes.
I mean, if they're underage, you know what
Yes.
I'm saying?
Yeah.
The second thing is sometimes, the freshman who's really nervous about doing the meeting, but they want to present what they feel they want in the meeting. Is it okay to note student had case manager present script of needs and worries?
Absolutely. I mean, what happens is that students really, they're critical. It's their transition plan, even though the parents have a lot of influence up to the point where before they become age of majority, it's still their interests and preferences that you should be taking completely into consideration. When it comes to parents not wanting the child at the IEP, I would absolutely definitely document that, but they're still legally, the school's district is still legally responsible for inviting them. Whether they attend or not, that may be a parent decision, but they are still bound to invite a child to the meeting.
And still documented.
Yeah,
So just
yeah,
student-
the child was
students
invited, but
presented
at the
their-
parent's
presented
request.
their- What
Yep.
they, even though the parents didn't want there,
Yeah.
is what they
Yep.
want, even though you don't want them to have X, Y, Z, but.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
So there was another case in Alabama, and I guess we didn't say it at the beginning, but the theme of part one is to show movement from the transition plan. So a ninth grade transition plan is going to start the conversation, and then you're gonna build on that each year. I mean, if they start in ninth grade, that's 4 transition plans. So you really wanna show movement and growth towards the attainment of post-secondary goals. And that may change based on student preference or transition assessments, or, it can change. But it is, post-secondary goal was, the student, I removed the name, will be prepared to participate in post-secondary education for years across. So that, again, is not really tailored to anything specific. It's a very broad outcome of a goal. Now, that's not saying if the child does know what they want to do as a freshman, that if the goal stays the same, because the child's preferences don't change, that's fine, but having this broad, well, the child will, participate in post-secondary education, it's not specific and individualized, which we know has to be the basis of everything in that document. Again, going back to transition assessments, again, it's unclear if they were completed annually. There was no documentation for that. And what happened with this case was that it was required that there was a reimbursement for an independent educational evaluation, which was a transition independent evaluation. And those, paying for somebody outside to do the evaluation, that it gets expensive again. And the whole reason that it was needing to be completed is because the district didn't do it. And for those case managers that write transition plans, they're normally the ones that do the transition assessments. So instead of just going through the process of completing transition assessments, this went through the due process, and it ended up costing the district a lot of money for something that they had to do that they probably could have done for free. And then also part of that, there was some compensatory services that were remanded to a lower court. But again, the litigation that's been around the country, you can see from these examples that it's following involving the student in their own transition planning, which seems like, well, yeah, obviously, but
Common sense,
exactly.
fundamental.
Yeah, but if it doesn't happen, it really impedes faith, which, again, IDEA is one of the most litigated regulations in the country, and 90% of those IDEA court cases are around faith. And if these things don't happen, it is impediment of faith.
Have we had any cases in Maine?
Not to the point where it's gone up through the circuit. I mean, there's due process and there's mediation, but not anything that's rose to this level.
And what we were told at this conference is through the National Technical Assistance Center conference, and is that probably transition is probably one of the next big litigated thoughts processes of what's going to be happening next. So thinking purposefully about transition planning is really important for children with disabilities in high school.
Yeah. I mean, the big takeaway from both of these is just ensuring that the child is part of the process. It is their post-secondary plan, so they should be heavily involved in this process. So looking at our data from Maine's standpoint, this is what we've reported to OSEP over the last 5 years. You can see that it's been very inconsistent in years past, and then in 2016, 2017, the compliance raised pretty significantly. The reason for that is the model was changed. The model of professional development was changed. What had happened before was either DOE representation or contracted individuals went to the superintendent regions around the state and provided a similar compliance training to those individuals, the directors and superintendents. And what we saw was that it didn't trickle down to the individuals that actually write the transition plans. So in 2015-16, that model switched. Roberta was really the head of that. And it was going into the districts and providing that professional development to the individuals that write the transition plans. Along with that, there was an opportunity for them to send feedback into the department and get direct feedback on the transition plans that they were writing. And they would receive whether it met compliance with the indicator or whether it didn't. So, sitting and getting the information, being able to practice it, really move the needle in terms of compliance to the point where you can see that we are at that 95%. We're currently right around there right now for the cohort that we're in right now. So we're sustaining it. But again, compliance is nice, but we really want to have and increase better outcomes for children and individuals with disabilities. So that's the purpose that we made this training, to say that's great, and it really does speak to the hard work of the special educators and special education administration around the state. But there is so much more beyond basic compliance that really can lead to better outcomes.
It's really a mindset. With the administrative, they're going to start with the transition plan with the junior, we start moving. No, that's it,
Yeah, for sure. So what happened based off of that is that we've had an increased number of compliant transition plans across the state, and that's through the professional development, through the feedback. Really, that end step is really showing that we have an increased number of compliant transition plans. So what does that mean? We should utilize that past knowledge of basic compliance with research-based strategies and practices to promote better outcomes for individuals with disabilities. So some national post-secondary data. So college university programming specifically for students with intellectual disabilities. So out of the 4,700 offered programs across the country, 263 of them have programs specific to students with intellectual disabilities. Now, I know the percentage. I know that there's work to be done. A number of programs that are available across the state. And that is likely due to the changes in the Higher Education Opportunity Act in 2008 and really providing more post-secondary